All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. Today we have Jessica Pishko, who is the author of The Highest Law in the Land, How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy. As you can see, I got a copy right here. So today we're going to be going through her book to discuss some of the finer points that she writes about. And we're going to speak about this book for about approximately 30 to 40 minutes. And then at the end, for the final approximately, I'd say 20-ish minutes, we will field questions from you in the audience for any questions that you have about the book and for Jessica and about, the process of writing, any finer points. On the book itself. So I will give Jessica the opportunity to introduce herself and kind of give a little bit of information about why she wanted to write the book and what kind of inspired her to go through that process. So Jessica, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And just to say, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you guys for coming and listening to me talk about this book. So I came to this book as someone who had grown up in Texas, and I had always known what sheriffs were largely from TV and mythology. So I always thought of sheriffs as, people in white hats who rode horses. It was very much a part of the kind of Western milieu that I knew as a kid. And when I began doing some work in the criminal justice space, what I noticed was that sheriffs were both one, elected, which is pretty unusual for law enforcement, and two, that they had a pretty unusually wide range of powers, both in criminal and civil types of law, which is very unusual for a local actor in that way, especially someone who has as much policing responsibility as sheriffs do. And to add that sheriffs also run local jails, which in the past 10 years or so have really become an important flexion point for people who are interested in the criminal legal system and the number of people who move through it. And around all that time, hence came COVID, and it was 2020. And then very suddenly, people were talking quite a lot about these sheriffs who were not enforcing mask mandates, who didn't want to enforce business closures, and who are also being really public about their opinions about things like COVID vaccines, the federal response to COVID. Of course, we know what happened later in January of 2021. And so that really got me thinking quite a lot about how to think about sheriffs, one, as an institution overall, and two, as this really politicized institution that seemed very connected to far right extremism and very much interested in, I think, mainstreaming a kind of far right ideology. Often called the constitutional sheriff movement, which we can talk a bit more about, and how to think about all of this in terms of what sheriffs did day to day. Because I think that one of the unusual things about sheriffs as far right actors is that they have, real jobs. They are elected to a position, but unlike maybe a House rep or a senator, they have a real job that involves interacting with a wide diversity of people. Often you might say that the people they interact with are among those who are the least powerful, right? They're the poor, they are, people who are Black and brown, they are people who are in jail, people who are houseless. And so I wanted to think about, how do we think about this far right movement in terms of what sheriffs do and what we are told they do, which of course in the course of the book I discovered that what sheriffs say they do and what they actually do might have some difference.
Excellent. Thank you. So I think the best way to open this is to explain to the audience what exactly a sheriff is. Um, so many might think of them as, another beat cop, patrolling the streets or writing traffic tickets or pulling over people for speeding or drunk driving. Sure, those are parts of the job description for enforcing the laws. But you kind of frame them in a way that makes them seem as much more than just a regular cop. So what makes them different, and where did the concept of sheriffs originate from?
So, put quite simply, a sheriff is an elected law enforcement official on the county level. This is rather important because it explains why they have such an important role, particularly in rural and suburban communities, which may not have city police, or where the city police need like a great deal of supplementation in terms of law enforcement capabilities. So that's why the county level part is important. It's also important because counties can vary in terms of population quite a lot, right? So you have some counties with, I mean, there's a county in Texas with like 50 people, and then you have counties with like many millions of people, and they all get one elected sheriff. So that's, I think, something that's useful to think about when you think about sheriffs as a sort of as a sort of collective uh, emphasis, right? That each sheriff represents maybe a very different number of people, but they're really attached to the land. And one of the things that sheriffs do that is unusual is that they are in charge of both some policing, and I want to be clear that there's over 3,000 sheriffs. The vast majority are elected, but there are a handful of exceptions, right? So, the exceptions are interesting to think about, but just I'm speaking kind of rather generally about the sheriff in most of these counties. About 85% of sheriffs run a county jail, which means they are in charge of both policing and arresting out on the street. They execute search warrants, they investigate crimes, and then they also bring the people into the jail. And this is also where they enact quite a lot of their powers, especially in terms of immigration law, because they are also in charge of things like booking someone into jail, talking about how they're held, what the conditions of their confinement are, whether people are in solitary or not, the size of the jail, what kind of programs are in jail. So they're in charge of all of these things, which is a very wide variety of tasks. But in addition, sheriffs have kind of a lot of unusual tasks that I think sort of fell to them by virtue of the history, right? So they, in many places, are in charge of firearm licensing. In places that still have firearm licensing, that's something they do. They are often in charge of evictions. So they often are the people who evict people from their homes, and the police are there to do that. They also do a lot of things that are kind of what people might consider in the community service. In many places, sheriffs are in charge of 911 response. They are in charge of animal control. They often play a big role in disaster relief, which is where some of their activities during COVID come from. Because we have a system that is very disparate, right? We have a system that relies on a lot of local control. Sheriffs, in and of themselves, tend to have a lot of responsibilities in these areas that I think most people don't think about very much because, I mean, quite frankly and gratefully, it may not come up. And that sort of gets to the history of the sheriff. So, one of the things I was very interested in writing the book was trying to track the history of the sheriff and see exactly where it came from and what the slippage was between what sheriffs say and what might be true. And what I found is that that's really difficult. The office of sheriff is an Anglo-Saxon tradition. This is something that sheriffs will frequently say. Comes from England. It seems to be, come from the words shire reeve. But in that role, sheriffs were really tax collectors. And some sheriffs are still tax collectors. If you look at many sheriffs, they will say they are the tax assessor or the tax collector, which is usually means they are in charge of something like the property taxes, like what people's property taxes are, which is actually kind of an important role that I think people don't think that much about. But so when the United States, what would become the United States, was formed, sheriffs got loosely imported into it. And it appears that, during the colonial era, there were sometimes something like sheriffs in some places, but it wasn't very consistent. What I found is that sheriffs became really popular in the United States during what some people call like the era of Jeffersonian. Thomas Jefferson talked a bit about this, but when Andrew Jackson was president, there was this idea of Jacksonian democracy. And Andrew Jackson had this idea that we needed more elected officials, especially local elected officials, so that voters who at the time were white men, that more white men would be able to have a say in their local government. And this was really important to this idea of like the yeoman farmer, the common man, right? And also this was a time of vast westward expansion. So, most people might know Andrew Jackson in terms of removing Native Americans from their land, in terms of trying to expand, white settlers westward. And this sort of coincided with something like the rise of the sheriff as an elected official. A lot of them were decommissioned military. There were a lot of wars in the early 1800s. So what happened was many sheriffs were loosely militia members. They belonged to small militias. They would bring their guys, across the land to the west, and they became a sort of quasi-military, quasi-law enforcement figure. Again, bearing in mind that like standardized law enforcement and courts and judges were not, we didn't really have that as much, right? This wasn't a very standard thing. And this also helps explain why sheriffs are a little different in different parts of the country, right? So sheriffs in the Midwest and West kind of rose to prominence as like deep mythological figures. Sheriffs in the Northeast has a lot of different kinds of law enforcement. Some people have heard of like constables or night watchmen, right? They sort of developed other forms of police alongside sheriffs, which I think made their policing system lightly different and helps explain why the sheriff plays like a larger political role in some parts of the country than others.
Okay. So I think that was a great way to kind of set the stage for a lot of the topics that you cover in the book. Now, I want to start obviously at chapter one. So you open the book by describing the institution of the sheriff and how it coincides with your attendance at this patriotic social gathering in Battle Mountain, Nevada. So can you tell us how that role of the sheriff was on display at that event and kind of what it was? And you also introduce, a character who is a through line throughout the entirety of the book, Richard Mack, and his influence on the constitutional sheriff's movement. I know it's a lot of questions, but I think it really sets the stage for the rest of the book. So let's start with the patriotic social gathering.
So in May, I think it was May of 2021, I attended a patriotic social gathering in Battle Mountain, Nevada, which is a pretty rural part of Nevada. Just to be clear, it was not a place I had been before, so it was a bit of an adventure for me to go out there. But I thought it was really important because one of the things I wanted to understand in the book was why people were attracted to the constitutional sheriff movement. I understood it as a sort of abstract academic topic, but I wanted to see what people were thinking about. And this Battle Mountain, this was a place that decided to have this rather large gathering. The county called it, sort of like a celebration of law enforcement. And also, I think, a little bit of a, snub to the federal government. And to bear in mind, this was a few months after January 6th. And I will say that one of the reasons why it starts the book is that it really altered it was something that stayed in my mind as I wrote the book, and my perception of it altered a great deal as I worked on the book. When I went, I was surprised to see a lot of signs for Trump 2024. And I will admit that I thought when I saw these signs, like, oh gosh, these people, this is wrong. They're going to get over. I thought to myself, this is something that people will change their minds about soon. That it felt like a relic of the past. And I thought, oh, well, this will change. This is not going to be true in a year. This must be something that isn't clicking, right? And then we know now, now we have Trump 2024. So I realized, as I worked at the book that, oh, this was actually something that was really important and really important to understanding the constitutional sheriff movement that I needed to pay attention to. And so in short, to kind of explain, the constitutional sheriff movement is basically a far right movement that is very much influenced by MAGA and Trump. And they argue in essence that sheriffs can decide which laws are constitutional or not. That's where the word constitutional sheriff comes from, not because they're in the US Constitution. And the the general gist of what they think is that sheriffs can enforce or not enforce laws depending on whether they think it comports with the Constitution, which they consider the first 10 amendments, the original Bill of Rights, which I think now we see as something that is generally popular on the right, like it's kind of merged into mainstream discourse. And it usually translates to a lot of emphasis on religious practices, emphasis on the Second Amendment and unlimited gun ownership, kind of an emphasis on libertarian values and the importance of private property, and limitations on federal government. They would say interference, I might say regulation. So these are sort of the basic tenets that they oppose. And I think that what's important to bear in mind is that this movement is, while it purports to be politically neutral, one of the things that was true about this patriotic social gathering was that it was patriotic in the sense that it was pro-Trump. Like there was nothing about it that was not pro-Trump, despite the fact that Trump was not running, that Trump was not yet running for president, that he was not president, that it wasn't clear he would be, that this was very much a movement that had gotten energy and merged with what I think we would call like the MAGA movement kind of generally in the same areas. Now that brings us to, and I think that the constitutional sheriff movement realized that this was a way to get more people on board, right? It was an opportunity to recruit and to spread their ideas. And it so happened that many of their ideas were similar. And we see that now, right? Unlimited Second Amendment, dislike of immigration, so a sort of xenophobia, I think is very important about immigration, and also dislike of LGBTQ people, distrust of gay rights, distrust of trans rights, and also this like, while they have a libertarian conception of property, this does not extend to like women's rights over their reproduction, right? They are very opposed to abortion. Just so to be clear, all of their tenets are aligned with, I think, the mainstream Republican Party, despite saying they're not political. And so the constitutional sheriff movement predates MAGA, and the individual most credited with kind of bringing it to popular attention is an ex-Arizona sheriff named Richard Mack. Now, Richard Mack is kind of an interesting figure, right? He comes from the sort of older far-right tradition. He was a sheriff in the 80s and early 90s. In the early 90s, the National Rifle Association recruited him alongside a few other sheriffs to file a lawsuit that opposed the Brady Bill. And the Brady Bill was what I think most people consider the first handgun regulation bill. And one of the major things the Brady Bill was doing was it imposed background checks for firearm purchases. This was one of the innovations of the Brady Bill. And the NRA brought this lawsuit because they realized that the bill was very popular. They couldn't lobby against it. So they brought this lawsuit. And, in the course of this lawsuit, what happened was first that they essentially won at the Supreme Court in an opinion written by Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia agreed, in essence, that the federal government could not compel sheriffs to do background checks, which is what they asked them to do. I want to add that this is no longer the case. Sheriffs don't do background checks. It's done automatically with computers at point of purchase, but sheriffs, and Richard Mack in particular, took this as a huge win. He has printed the case with his name on it. So the case is captioned Prince v. United States, but Richard Mack prints his own version. That's Mack v. United States because it sounds cooler. It's him, right? Right. It also sort of emphasizes his perception of himself opposing the federal government. Right. And he kind of took this as like street cred and went on the road, basically appearing at many far right gatherings, right, in the 90s. So he sort of pops up, and this is where he pops up at the classic, pops up at Ruby Ridge. He pops up at Waco. He pops up when Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma City federal building. He starts to pop up in all these instances, kind of pro-militia, but sort of arguing that like sheriffs are going to help militias become more legitimate. And I think that one of the things that's a bit interesting about Richard Mack is that constitutional sheriffs was really something he landed on that worked. He tried to run for office many times, right? He ran for the Texas House. he ran for sheriff, he lost. He ran for Senate, he lost. He ran for a lot of other offices, he didn't win. And he ran a fake campaign for president on a reality show. So, like, we have to understand Richard Mack's appeal to the constitutional sheriff movement as, again, kind of based in a little bit of it's like both far right extremism, but also a lot of grift, right? He sells supplements. He sell, when Y2K was a thing, he was like involved in selling, Y2K materials. He's afraid of 5G. And so it naturally made sense to him to try to bring this to sheriffs and argue, as he would say, like, sheriffs are the solution, which to say that sheriffs will kind of keep the far right under control and legitimize militias and the militia movement in a way that will make it more palatable to more people. Now, what's interesting about that is, in a sense, he is sort of right in that I think a lot of tenets of the constitutional sheriff movement are now more mainstream. Like, I would argue it's pretty mainstream. And also, there is like this certain appeal for a lot of, going back to the patriotic rally, where they brought on stage, I think, like 6 or 8 sheriffs in Nevada, all saying that they would protect people's constitutional rights and that they opposed, lockdowns, and they wanted to protect the people. That there is like this appeal, particularly for people who feel really alienated from the federal government, that are like elected officials they can see every day. They look cool. They're, Western mythology, they're police, and they're here to like help you, right? And this plays upon, again, this like mythology of the sheriff as helper, going to be there for you. Again, going back to my Texas childhood, like, it's the guy in the white hat, and how can you hate a sheriff, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to transition into, the next chapter where you talk about posse comitatus. Um, and so you kind of talk about the legacy of, William Potter Gale, and of course Leslie Swift is involved in that as well. And I think, for a bit of background, if anybody's not familiar with these two folks, they are two of the progenitors of the Christian identity movement in the United States. If you're not sure what that is, it is kind of a take of British Israelism, where they claim that white Anglo-Saxons are the true descendants of the ancient Israelites, and it's a deeply anti-Semitic religious, quote unquote, religious movement um, that took off the United States in kind of like the 50s and 60s. And we also have a POE report on Christian identity that we will link in the chat if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Um, so let's kind of focus on William Potter Gale and his influence on forming posses. So I think here's a good point to kind of differentiate between what these sheriffs say makes a posse versus a militia, and what sort of role Gale played in that.
Yeah, I mean, the posse militia thing is very interesting because, I mean, today there are still, like, sheriff posses are generally still legal, right? A lot of places, in some places, they can still compel people to serve in a posse. So the olden time posse comitatus rule was like the hue and cry. So let's say there's a bandit, horse thief, or whatever, the sheriff would ride around and say, like, bring all the armed men between the ages of, I think it was like 16 and 50, or what, able-bodied men, come and rally, and we're going to go chase it down. And it has uses in the modern world. They still use it. And in some places, if you don't serve when called, you get charged with like a misdemeanor. So if the sheriff says, we need you to join our posse, and you're like, no, thank you, then you don't have the option. And today posses like still exist, and a lot of them are ceremonial. I want to be clear. Like, you might see the posse at like a parade or football games, and they ride horse. Some of them are like volunteers, and they ride horses, and they serve like a ceremonial role. Now, back in the day when they had posses, the posse was basically like the unit of law enforcement. And one can think of it as, and this is how a lot of law enforcement worked. Like, law enforcement was ad hoc. everybody, most men, white men were armed. And so if you needed to go do some policing, you would get a group together. And, in the West, it took a system. It was called it was a vigilante system. They were called vigilance committees, and they would meet up in your local bar place. You would meet up in the saloon and say, hey, what are we going to do today? Oh, these no good people rode into town and we're going to go get them. And that was your posse, right? And so they kind of were. And the thing is, they kind of were militias, again, because most of these people were decommissioned officers. Many, especially in the West, had fought in the Spanish American War. They were looking to do fighting. That was what a lot of them came to the West to do. And the sheriff was sort of like, oh, okay, let's do this. Now, William Potter Gale and Wesley Swift, who I don't talk quite as much in the book, but he was like the progenitor to William Potter Gale, thought that the posse would be an interesting idea because they had this idea that citizens could form their own posses with or without the sheriff. And I think the important part about this posse comitatus, trying to think of what posse comitatus movement, was that if the sheriff didn't like the posse comitatus movement, that was like too bad, right?
Mm.
Like the citizens would form the posse and the sheriff could say yay or nay. And if the sheriff said nay, well, then he was no good and it was okay to get rid of him. And the other important thing to bear in mind is when posse comitatus was very popular in the sort of, as you say, 50s, 60s, 70s, most sheriffs were not into it. Like sheriffs were like, we don't want a part of this. They did not like them. They viewed them as essentially criminals. It's like, this is criminal activity. They fought them. They saw them and they were very violent, is I think an important thing about the posse comitatus movement, because they were so pro-gun and kind of had a militaristic, violent vibe about them. There were a lot of shootouts. People died. Law enforcement died, trying to fight with some of these people. So they were really seen as like a menace. They were not good. And there was a lot of ink spilled in like the local news about the posse comitatus movement and how difficult they were. And they really were, I think today they were progenitors of the militia movement is how I think is best to explain it. Now they did do a lot of things, like they would have a star, they'd pin and they'd sign a thing like I'm the sheriff's posse. But again, it did not require the involvement of the sheriff, which I think is an important distinction to make in all fairness. And a lot of those movements, again, they are also linked to sovereign citizen movements, which all became popular, often because people were in genuine distress. So William Potter Gale, his movement was inspired by the desegregation of schools. So the idea was like, oh, well, we can prevent the Supreme Court from forcing us to desegregate schools. And as we all know, this was called the Southern Strategy. This was a widespread movement across the South in many places to prevent desegregation. And there was also recruitment among a lot of people, especially people who owned farms in the Midwest. Very popular. There was a crisis in which many farmers defaulted on their mortgages, their land was repossessed, and they felt a lot of anger towards the government. Also, as you point out, it was very anti-Semitic, so there's a lot of anger towards what they viewed as like Jewish bankers who had, defaulted on their loans. And so this kind of far right movement gained popularity among many of these people who saw themselves as sort of wronged by bankers and the federal government and also immigrants. So there was, an instance in which an immigrant family purchased a farm that had been defaulted on, right? And so posse comitatus members tried to chase the new purchasers out. And so this idea again of like, well, the heartland, these people are stealing something from us in the heartland. Which I think helps explain a lot of the intense xenophobia and anti-Semitism. And that movement many people would say kind of flamed out, generally because it was so violent. Like people died in shootouts, the leaders died, and it sort of faded away. But this kind of got resurrected into other far-right movements like the militia movement, like sovereign citizens, like constitutional sheriffs. They sort of it's kind of like the original like plasmic ooze that created a lot of these far right movements. It's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. I think that's another good transition point to talk about the sheriff's involvement in the broader modern militia movement when we think of, three percenters and oath keepers. I think it was either Mac or Sheriff Lamb that you mentioned that was pretty t in pretty tight with Stuart Rhodes, founder of the Oath Keepers. So one, I think we should hit on how they're influential in the modern militia movement that kind of spurned from Waco and Ruby Ridge and the early sort of mid 90s. And then kind of focus on because the militia movement is still part of, it's still integral to this broader sort of immigration conversation and with border militias, going on these vigilante border patrols and everything like that. So first, how do constitutional sheriffs kind of facilitate or fit into this anti-government extremism sort of militia movement? And how is that tied to the broader conversation around immigration and where militias fit into that conversation?
I think that, I mean, one could argue, I kind of argue in the book that the constitutional sheriff movement really hitched itself to Stuart Rhodes and the Oath Keepers, and that helped them become more popular. What
Mhm.
seems to have happened is that around 2008, Stuart Rhodes basically, the Tea Party came, right? There's sort of a general far right revolt similar to Posse Comitatus, but more political, right? The Tea Party movement, we had a lot of politicians come out of this movement. And I talk a little bit about Cleon Skousen and the revival of his ideas with Glenn Beck and other politicians. So like we had this revival of these ideas, and Stuart Rhodes and Richard Mack and a few other kind of leaders and militia groups basically did a road show, and they
Mhm.
were all. Stuart Rhodes was also deeply influenced by Cleon Skousen as well. Both of them, it seems like they probably met through the Mormon Church and like LDS connections, but they kind of went on a road show together, basically talking about militias and talking about how constitutional sheriffs were important for militias. Again, really echoes of like Posse Comitatus, just like I would say maybe a little more toned down, right? Because general politics was with him, but the argument Stuart Rhodes was positing was that people could form militias, and Mac was there to say, oh, and sheriffs will support you and give you legitimacy, right? And so the two kind of went on the road. At the time that Stuart Rhodes started doing this, Richard Mack was not doing that well. Like he was like teaching and he ran a used car dealership, and he didn't seem like he was on his way up until he attached himself to Stuart Rhodes. So I actually got the impression that Stuart Rhodes kind of helped him out and brought him back. And that really sort of started to spread this constitutional sheriff movement again, along with Tea Party movement. So this, a lot of Tea Party meetings became kind of Tea Party, Oath Keeper, constitutional sheriff groups. Like they started all to agree on the same thing, right? The ideas kind of influenced each other. And I think that was, in fact, really important. I mean, one of Richard Mack's and the Oath Keepers' really important tenets is the Second Amendment. And if you put yourself back when Barack Obama was elected president, there was generated a huge amount of panic about the federal government. One would say because he was the first Black president, there's a huge amount of panic about federal government, federal overreach, and also federal seizure of guns in particular. And this sort of comes up every time there was a horrific mass shooting. So the Sandy Hook massacre, of course, became something that Oath Keepers and constitutional sheriffs and the Tea Party could rally around to say, see, the federal government is trying to take away our guns, right? This is where you sort of got like constant rhetoric of Obama wants to take our guns, Hillary Clinton wants to take our guns. They sort of revive this idea. And the thing about the Second Amendment was that it became a really good recruiting tool for other sheriffs, I think. Other sheriffs who might be less inclined to align with the militias publicly did feel probably pushed by their supporters to align themselves with pro Second Amendment movements. Like I think, well, maybe some of them felt this. I mean, it's hard to know if they felt this genuinely in their hearts, but certainly among their constituents, it was very important to them that they, quote unquote, stand up to the federal government and say, we will support your Second Amendment right to firearms. Now, I want to caveat this by saying, again, this relates back to the part where sheriffs don't necessarily represent population centers. So let's say you have, I think there was a letter after the Sandy Hook massacre where some 100, 200 sheriffs signed. To bear in mind, those 200 sheriffs do not represent by any stretch of the imagination even close to most of the country, right? But it looks like a lot of sheriffs. So they realized that by bringing a lot of sheriffs in, it could look like a popular movement, even though it's actually like very much opposed to the popular will of the people. This is sort of where I start to get into the danger of like why it's a threat to democracy, that they disproportionately emphasize by their numbers, kind of like the electoral college, right? They disproportionately emphasize right wing, really far right wing people, and delegitimize what we might call like the democratic will, or what the majority of people want.
Okay. And then how does that sort of filter into the border militia issue surrounding immigration?
Yeah, so the border militia one, there was a few different versions of border militias that popped up, and some I get into, but one of the things that happened was that there's a group called FAIR, Federation for American Immigration Reform, and they really decided that basically they could bring sheriffs, especially constitutional sheriffs, into the fold, and bring in kind of border militias into the fold, and sort of legitimize it again as like a populist movement. FAIR is part of a Tantan network, which is basically like a xenophobic anti-immigration group. That's all they do. But the role of FAIR is to make basically to make anti-immigration policy look popular. And the way they made it look popular was to have these sort of, they had a few like border trainings where they would bring sheriffs to the border and bring border militias to the border, and Richard Mack, and sort of try to recruit sheriffs to be anti-immigrant. And the thing about that is that honestly, FAIR, I think, is one of the more successful things. Like these anti-immigration movements kind of ended up being fairly successful because they ended up recruiting quite a lot of sheriffs. At the same time, right, there was, and this was true in the Obama years as well, right, there was this like expansion of the immigration system through secure communities, and an immigration in the role of sheriffs in terms of deportations and flagging people for deportations in their jails. So it coincided with this ability of sheriffs to use federal law in existence to facilitate the deportation of people. And many of them, not coincidentally, were part or participated in these sort of quasi border militia, border training movements. And this is something that Trump continued when he was president, right? He tapped into this already existing network of, nonprofit groups and sheriffs and border militias to recruit actual sheriffs to do actual deportation. So it, again, similar to militias, kind of legitimizes something that isn't legitimate, right? Like the idea that there's too many immigrants and that immigration is a problem and that we need to deport more people became an idea that they could legitimize through like sheriffs using actual law. And that's where I think that the role of sheriffs is particularly alarming, I guess I would say. Like, I am most worried about that because sheriffs, again, can use actual laws. So to talk about militias and guns, for example, if sheriffs choose to ignore red flag laws, which are laws that take guns away from people who might be dangerous. So let's say you are in a county with a constitutional sheriff who won't enforce a red flag law, and you are afraid that your abuser might come after you. Well, that sheriff can just not do it, and you have very little recourse, right? There's very little you can do. Same with deportations. If you are in a county where your sheriff opts to cooperate a great deal with ICE, use racial profiling to flag people for deportation, there's very little you can do, right? You can't appeal to another authority because those actions are legal. Like, it's legal for the sheriff to do that. And so this is where I think it's like a great concern, right? Because you have the sheriff legitimizing something, and they can kind of legitimize it, whether they ought to or not, right? They sort of can because of the discretion law enforcement have.
Okay. And I think you're doing a great job of giving me transitions here.
Good.
So I think the last question that I am going to ask before I move on to the audience is a point that I found especially you know important. So and I think when you talk about the sheriff's role in immigration. So, of course, that brings up the point of detention. And a lot
Mm.
of these migrants that they apprehend end up in county jails because ICE facilities can't hold that many people. So they end up moving to county jails. And of course, the sheriffs are in charge of county jails. And you bring up a lot of the issues that are present within county jails in chapter 6. And you kind of use, or not use, but highlight the death of Lamar Johnson in East Baton Rouge to use as sort of a case example or a case study with the issues that are present within county jails. And of course, since sheriffs are in charge of it, they kind of are responsible for those conditions. Um, so talk about how, conditions in county jails are under the guise of the county sheriffs and what do you think that the reader should take from that section of the book?
Well, I think that the first thing, I think people don't think a lot about county jails. And, probably because hopefully many readers haven't been there. So that's what I have. And county jails, range in size from like thousands and thousands. So like Houston's county jail is like 6,000. Los Angeles has a gigantic county jail system that's like 8 to 10,000. And then there's county jails that hold like 20 people.
Mhm.
So they range a great deal in size, and they also range a great deal in like how sheriffs manage them and the amount of oversight they get from other authorities, right? So, I think the thing about county jails is that basically they are really dangerous, and we do not have a good system of tracking how dangerous they are. There's a lot of reasons county jails are dangerous. For one thing, you're taking people in immense distress and putting them all together, and they don't have your medicine. Like I sometimes, when you are arrested, it's not like, oh, can I go pick up my kids or go get my meds or I need to call my doctor? Like, no, they haul you in. I mean, if you've been into like a booking, I was in a booking center. They just bring people in. I mean, they're barefoot in their pajamas. They're maybe coming down off of substances. They're very distressed. It's very distressing to get arrested. So they come in all these states, and then they basically get is your heart working? They sort of get like, are you breathing? Is your heart working? And then they get booked, and then they have to wait. So everything you want to do or know, or when are you getting out? Where am I going? What's going to happen? You just don't know. You wait, and someone will tell you when they feel like telling you. And basically, if you are in immigration detention, an ICE detention, it's the same. And in many places, they just put you in with all the same, you're with the same people. Sometimes they separate ICE detention, interestingly, because there are a few more rules for ICE detention. Like they have to treat people, there's more rules about how you treat people in ICE detention. That was actually one of the things Donald Trump took away when he was president. He eliminated these extra protections. So like ICE detainees, as a result, were put into jails that were terrible, quite frankly. That did not qualify as ICE detention, but and why they still held people is another question. But like they have sort of a slightly separate set of rules. And I think that one of the things about jails that struck me was, one, how much of a black box they are, which I think it makes sense. Like people can't go in and out freely. Two, how badly they treat people in there, but also the families of people who die, right? It really struck me that moms and relatives, they don't learn that something happened to their loved one for days sometimes. I mean, it's just, kind of hard. It's hard to envision how that happens, but, because the role of the sheriff is generally to protect their liability, there's not a lot of consideration about how they treat family members. And three, I think the most important thing is that it kind of exposes what I think is a bit of the lie about the constitutional sheriff movement. The constitutional sheriff movement says like, oh, we are the people. We care about the community. We are taking care of our people. And when you look at county jails, and constitutional sheriffs run county jails as badly. I mean, like there is not like they run county jails better. It's actually not clear they run them worse, but there's no like, it's not like they are better at it. And when you look at that and say, well, if you care about your community, well, who are these people in the jail then? Because people in the county jail that's your community. And you don't seem to be spending a lot of time or attention on them. I mean, I was just thinking of there's a sheriff in Washington State, Bob Songer, who is a well-known constitutional sheriff. He is now a Claremont fellow, which is like the new sheriff far right thing. And his jail is, terribly run. He has someone in charge who is like a far right politician who doesn't know anything about running a jail. And they seem to care very little about the people in there and how they're treated. And I think that it's fair to ask, well, why, if they purport to care about the community, are they treating these people in their custody with direct control so badly? Like what sort of a bit like, well, then what they're saying seems to me to be exposed to be like this deep lie that, well, you're not treating your community well, because what these people are your community.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So that sort of ends the formal portion for me, for my questions for you. So we'll move on to the questions from our audience. So the first one says, do you think a lot of these locally elected constitutional sheriffs are aware of the broader sovereign citizen movement, or are they too isolated to know about the violence that the broader movement has imposed on society?
I think that's a really good question. And what I will say is it's a mix. So the first thing to point out is that a lot of these sheriffs who are involved in the far right sheriff movement, they're not watching like CNN, and they're not like attending program on extremism lectures and stuff, right? Like they're probably not. One of them read my book and didn't like it, but they're probably not like reading my book or reading reports. Like they just aren't. And the news they're consuming is Newsmax, is basically what like they're consuming Newsmax. And because the constitutional sheriff movement has quite frankly merged so deeply with Trumpism and MAGA, they don't see a lot of daylight between the two, and they see what they're doing as essentially supporting the Republicans. Like at this point, they're supporting Donald Trump. Donald Trump is in essence supporting the constitutional sheriff movement, and they don't see a lot of daylight. So it's become, one, I think, more mainstream. And two, I think to the extent that they see it, when the Southern Poverty Law Center writes a report, et cetera, at this point, they now see it as a mark of pride that, well, the liberal media hates us. And this happened to me repeatedly when I do work. I think I talk a bit about like Mark Lamb, Richard Mack too, will use my reporting as like recruitment. Like this liberal writer doesn't like constitutional sheriffs. And so we are good. They're sort of like, look what she wrote. She says we support an unlimited Second Amendment. You're right, we do. Like, this is a good thing. Or we support election investigations. You're right, we do support that. Like, that's a good thing. Now, I will say this, it didn't used to be that way. It used to be that constitutional sheriffs were seen as like a liability for the county because of Joe Arpaio and the amount of money Joe Arpaio cost.
Yeah.
So when the patriotic social gathering happened in Battle Mountain, there was one county commissioner who said, like, I am not a big fan of this. Can we not do this? And what she brought up was like the liability. Now, I will say, so there was one person. Now, I will say she was shouted down. And I think what we do see is that we have seen this, that people get primaried from the right. So even sheriffs who might be dubious, I am frequently told by sheriffs something like, well, I don't believe all of it. Like, do you believe everything that you hear? I'm just listening with an open mind, et cetera. And they pick and choose. They feel kind of pressured because they will get primaried from the right. And that's a very real concern, I think, for all local officials right now, is that if the voters decide that their sheriff is not like constitutional sheriff enough, they will just find someone who is. And they will get voted out of office. That's happening like in Idaho. It's happening in like a few different places where sheriffs will just quite frankly face a primary opponent and they'll get voted out. So I think well, I sometimes say like the sheriffs don't love the far right as much as the far right loves the sheriff, as in Posse Comitatus. They feel compelled to oblige. And this applies with militias too. They feel compelled to cooperate because they see them as their voters.
Yeah. So I think there's two related questions here. So first is, how can we ensure local law enforcement officials are educated and following trainings on the history of groups like the posses and sovereign citizen movement to avoid issues like shootouts? So how can law enforcement be, stay up to date with the history and avoid violence? And then in your research, did you observe any counter narratives that disrupt the circulation and emergence of historic dynamics associated with posses, and their agendas?
I think, well, in terms of the education and training, I do think generally one of the reasons why Richard Mack is popular is that there isn't very good law enforcement training. And sheriffs in particular do not get very good training. In most places, sheriffs don't need to have any particular training to become a sheriff, and particularly in rural places. So I will say one of the ways Richard Mack became popular is by conducting trainings. And
Yeah,
in Texas, for example, his trainings were certified. And I think that that's important. His trainings are still, I think, viable trainings. And if I don't know if they still are in a few states, but he would come to town and do a training. And sheriffs are like, cool, it's a training. I'm going to learn information. This is what the Claremont Institute does. Oh, we're going to learn about the Federalist Papers and I'm going to get educated. Now, the problem is, and this sort of relates more, I think, to the problem of law enforcement training all over, is that they're not vetted in advance. Nobody's vetting them. Like in Texas, the reason why it happened is nobody vets the program. Nobody knew who Sheriff Mack was. And even when they sort of knew, they were just like, whatever, like they don't, because of the, I think, polarization of media, if the left-wing media, if the mainstream media says something, it gets kind of dismissed. And that's just unfortunately like sort of the reality. And so he does offer a training. Now, one could build a better system of training that incorporated this. Now, the problem, of course, is training is done state by state, and states have their own requirements. So that sort of requires like a statewide push to improve trainings overall and vet trainings. And there are other articles about problematic trainings of police, right? The sort of like the trainings of like battle ready, like there's other problematic training the police learn. And so I do think this is like a system that can be improved. And that would also improve this problem of constitutional sheriff trainings, right? So that is one issue. In terms of pushing back, I think that what many people have tried to do, there's two main things people have tried to do. One is civilian oversight, which is very popular in some places, like California has now made it so that counties can implement civilian oversight if they want to. That is certainly one thing. And I think the second thing people have been doing is trying to elect different sheriffs, right? There is, just as there was with prosecutors, there is a movement to elect what you would call like progressive minded sheriffs, or sheriffs who oppose these things. I think what's very hard about that is, one, elections have to go county by county, which means you have to find a viable candidate, which is hard. Some states, Washington State is looking at a lot of proposals that would require the vetting of sheriffs. So they have a new law that requires they sort of an independent authority that people can file complaints to, anonymous complaints that get investigated by the state, which I think is really important because lawsuits kind of don't cut it, puts people on the line. So they sort of have an independent investigation, and they include things like being a member of the Oath Keepers or being a member of the Three Percenters as disqualifying. So you could lose your law enforcement license if you're a member of the Oath Keepers. I do think that this is like something that it should be expanded to sheriffs. The biggest problem there is the sheriff lobby. One of the greatest successes of the constitutional sheriff movement is to give sheriffs this idea that they can't be governed. They're ungovernable, right? That when the legislature seeks to impose limits on sheriffs say, oh, well, we're a constitutional office. We're very important. No one can tell us what to do. And what I will say as like a positive thing is like, this is not true. You can absolutely, it is false. You can regulate sheriffs just like you can regulate police, just like you can regulate everything else. They are law enforcement officials. The state decides if they have a license or not, and the state can regulate them just as the state regulates everything else, that law enforcement does. They can do it. And I personally would like to see more like viable proposals to regulate. I mean, I was asked like a simple thing to do, and I said, well, maybe the federal government shouldn't give money to sheriffs who are members of the Oath Keepers. It's a thing you could do. I mean, there are sheriffs who are known members of Oath Keepers who get federal funding and state funding. You could say, well, no, you can't get that. That would at least put some pressure on them, like at least a pressure to say, like, we don't think this is good and we don't like this, or like should sheriffs who are known far-right sheriffs and members of FAIR be able to be part of the 287G program, which is the jail program that enables sheriffs to work with ICE to deport people. I mean, I would argue that program should be eliminated, but so why are we using it? Like, it's basically just being used to let extremist sheriffs deport more people and racially profile. So I'm sort of like, well, let's start to eliminate like the sources that give them equal power, and maybe that will at least put some pressure or symbolic pressure on the fact that like that this is not okay. I mean, in the book, I pretty much argue that we shouldn't have sheriffs. And so I stand by that. And so I think anything to diminish the power of sheriffs is a very important movement in that direction.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I will take one more question from the audience. It'll be a quick one. So, how have more mainstream sheriff's associations like the NSA reacted to the constitutional sheriff's movement?
They have reacted very poorly. So what I will say is this: the National Sheriff Association in the 2010s pushed back and said that they did not think the constitutional sheriff movement was legitimate, but they have since changed their minds. This is another pressure point that I would like to see more people put pressure on the NSA to disavow themselves. They have FAIR at all their conferences. They recently had this far right pastor give a prayer. He's this anti-abortion pastor who argues what's called the doctrine of lesser magistrates, which is a sort of Christian nationalist version of constitutional sheriffs. And they have people who are known affiliates of the constitutional sheriff movement in their leadership. So I have asked the NSA repeatedly, like, what's their plan? What are they going to do? And the last time I talked to them, they said to me, well, the constitutional sheriff movement has a point. Sheriffs don't have to enforce all the laws. So that's where the NSA is now. And I think like this is another one. I think they should put more pressure. You should not have sheriffs associated with the movement in leadership. They had a sheriff in leadership who was present on January 6th. I didn't think that. I thought that was a bad idea, right? And the NSA opt to do nothing. And their kind of line is like, well, sheriffs are politicians and therefore entitled to make political statements. And that, right, is sort of free speech argument, which is, I think, what most of the far right uses. But I think that, people can and should ask more. And I think that the NSA's the NSA capitulating to it is, I think, a sign of like the constitutional sheriff movement's sort of mainstream success.
Yeah. Well, that was certainly a lot. We covered a lot of ground during this event. So like I said, in the interest of time, I think we will call it because we're coming up on our 1 hour mark. And I don't want to take up any more of your day. So with that, firstly, I'd like to thank all of our attendees for making it to this Zoom session today. Thank you for attending and thank you for supporting the program. And secondly, I'd like to thank Jessica for attending this and giving us the opportunity to talk about her book and a topic that's, very important to her and to many others who are involved in this sort of research area. So Jessica, where can people purchase your book?
So I think maybe people will put a link out. So you can purchase my book on bookshop.org or Amazon. There's also an audiobook and I think a Kindle version if that is more helpful to you. I do not read the audiobook, which is good news for everybody. You can also find me generally online. My handle is Jess Pish, just JESSPISH on, I think, Blue Sky and Twitter. I also have a Substack that's sheriffs.substack.com where I try to post sheriff news. I've been behind of late because of the problems in Asheville, but I hope to get back on it. I just posted the 2024 Claremont Sheriff Fellows, which we didn't have time to get into, but I think is sort of the new thing to be concerned about, let's say.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. For anybody who had to leave early or couldn't make it at the beginning, this is being recorded and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel as soon as we are finished. So again, thank you for attending. Thank you, Jessica, for coming aboard and speaking with us, and we look forward to everybody attending our next events.